Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I am Fifi Peters, and corruption is the thread of this evening's show. But before we get to that, just a quick reminder that Paul Kagame, who is the president of one of Africa's least corrupt countries, that's Rwanda, will give his first ever live interview here on CNBC Africa right after Capital Connection. Back to the show, however. On the agenda, our panel of experts take a view on corruption and the ways to combat the all-too-common grand theft by politicians, bureaucrats and corporations that treat the public purse as their own personal bank account. In our Youth Africa segment, Reabetswe Ngwane reflects on her recycling business that has given the 25-year-old a reputation as one of the continent's most innovative entrepreneurs. But first, let's take a look at the stories making headlines in Africa with Anazi Zoti.
Thank you, Fifi. State-owned Ethiopian Airlines is poised to become Africa's largest airline by revenue and profit after signing a shareholding agreement with Zambia to relaunch the Southern African country's flag carrier at a startup cost of $30 million. Ethiopian Airlines in recent years has brushed aside regional competitors Kenya Airways and the debt-ridden South African Airways through sound management practices and strategic vision. And it's not stopping there, as it continues to buy shares in other African airlines to gain a competitive advantage over its Gulf airline rivals. The average home loan handed out to Kenyan banks in the past years has increased by nearly 20% to about $110,000. Kenya's central bank, in a report released yesterday, attributed the sharp increase of home loan borrowing amounts to rising house prices, rather than more people entering the housing market. The independent investment bank, Kestrel Capital, and the largest stockbroker and bond trader listed on the Nairobi Security Exchange, recorded a 7-fold jump in the net profit for the first 6 months of 2018.
Now, South Africa's state capture judicial inquiry that could result in former South African President Jacob Zuma being implicated in corrupt activities kicked off this week, while in tandem an inquiry headed by Judge Robert Nugent into the running of the country's tax authority is also in play. On the face of it, two separate investigations. Are they connected? CNBC Africa's Avuwe Mdila is at the South African Revenue Service inquiry in Pretoria. How's it, Avuwe? In essence, are these two inquiries really an autopsy of former President Zuma's decade of power?
Well, Fifi, that is what it seems like is happening, that the whole tenure of President Jacob Zuma is being scrutinized by both these inquiries. Of course, Tom Mayane is widely speculated to be a man that was in his corner, appointed by him, of course. So this inquiry into the tax affairs of SARS and also governance issues of SARS is basically looking at issues that have been spanning over the last 5 or so years. I've heard heart-rending testimonials today of over 150 million of taxpayers' money that was essentially wasted in the last 3 years at SARS because of inefficiencies, and also attorneys, SARS attorneys that haven't been paid for over the last 2 or 3 years. That was a testimony given by one of the senior managers at SARS currently, Dion Nanulel. That is the situation that's going on, that's been happening throughout the day, hearing these heart-rending testimonials of also specialized units that have been disbanded, units that focused on criminal investigations, looking into fraud and also issues around money laundering. Those units that we've heard have been disbanded. So, and also another parallel inquiry that is happening at this moment is also, of course, the state capture inquiry, the Zondo inquiry, looking at issues that involve the allegations around state capture, as you mentioned earlier, that could implicate South African president. Over there, there we heard the lawyers come on the first day of that inquiry, the lawyers representing President Jacob Zuma, representing the notorious Gupta family, who's also closely linked to state capture, and also the former public enterprise minister, Lynn Brown. The lawyers there the first day saying that while they don't want to disturb those proceedings, they do want to be included within the state capture inquiry. They want to be given an opportunity to also cross-examine the witnesses that will be taking a stand, and also, of course, that will be beneficial for their clients. So that's the situation happening around state capture, and also the inquiry looking at governance issues and also tax affairs at SARS.
Riabetse Ngwane is an alchemist. She turns rubbish into money. Our Capital Connection correspondent Anazi Zoti spoke with her a little earlier.
Ria, thank you so much for joining us on Capital Connection today.
And thank you very much for having me.
Ria, let's start with where you come from. So you come from Mahwase township in Rustenburg. Has that had an influence on you starting this business?
Definitely. Growing up in Mahwase, I was raised by my mom and my grandmother, both of whom were entrepreneurs themselves. So my grandmother used to have cows, as well as a shop that she was running for the local community. And my mom equally as well worked for the Defence Force, and equally after that she then went into her own space. So that definitely contributed towards my journey of wanting to start my business, my own business, and luckily it's been alongside my sister as well. So it's been a long-running generational endeavor, if I may put it that way.
Of course. And you obviously make these
Yes.
handbags made out of tire tubes. Tell us, how has it progressed over the years so far, this business?
It's been a very interesting journey, the business, because we started off wanting to solely do fashion bags, but we kept on encountering different conversations and different individuals coming to us with different problems. So the first instance was a contractor within the mines that came to us and said one of their products was not sustainable and lasting very long. And that's how we then delved into the mining and construction industries, including the corporate gifting. So everything has been a solution to a problem, and that's how the business has grown.
Wow, that's such an interesting story. So you obviously use wastes to create these products. How is your view? How do you look at wastes when you see waste? You obviously see an end product, but some people might want to throw it away. So how do you view waste?
Waste is, to me, a material. It's a resource. It's the same as how you would mine platinum or mine diamonds. It's a resource that can be used for alternatives, and I think that's what I would urge everyone to look at waste as. So it's not just the tin that you discard, but that tin can be used to create other products. Your plastics can be used to create cotton, if I'm not mistaken. That's what certain people do with it. So I think that's how we viewed the whole process, and that's how we've also been able to expand our business beyond just the fashion bags, but also delve into other industries.
Okay, you say delve into other industries. Can you talk about your products with the mining industry?
So our products with the mining industry contain or include the respirator bags, the first aid kit bags, as well as something called a seed protector, which is mainly used by the guys that work underground as they're drilling, and it serves as a protective gear for them. So that has also allowed us to expand in that industry as well, not just because we started off with respirator bags and everything else came as a consequence. So it's led up quite well.
Nice. Your business has a huge social significance on recycling, obviously. So how, what is the kind of impact are you looking to have in your community?
I think definitely to change the perspective of our community. So luckily we are based in a part of the community that is quite big on recycling. So we've got a cash for scrap yard, we've got a landfill quite close to where we are. So there's a general buzz and there's a general conversation about waste, but I think what we serve as is your cradle to grave where they can be able to see the raw material, what it's produced into, and how it is then later sold into market, and it becomes another product, you know. So I think it's changing the perspective of waste and making them realize that the conventional employment is another route, but there's another routes as well that they can delve into to try and make money.
Wow, thank you so much for coming on to Capital Connection. It was great having you on the show.
And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Anazi. Now, coming up after the break, our panel discusses the center of corruption and how it handicaps development across the continent at the expense of the people's hopes, health, and dreams. Stay watching. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now, corruption takes many forms, from blatant theft, political patronage, through to police at roadblocks, pilfering cash from motorists. But no matter what the method, the results are the same. Corruption corrodes and hollows out state institutions and lays waste essential services such as education, health, and housing. Left unchecked, it leads to a dysfunctional state and further down the road, a failed one.
In Rwanda, corruption is there. That's like any other places. I think even number one on the list, they still have corruption. But the difference is that when you compare to other countries, I've traveled to different countries, you find that at least here, it's still at minimum, you know, and it's really punished. So people, they're afraid of, you know, giving out this corruption.
Joining us to discuss corruption in Johannesburg is the Transport Portfolio Manager with the Organization for Undoing Tax Abuse, that's Rudie Heyneke, and also in Johannesburg via Skype is Corruption Watch Executive David Lewis. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. And Rudie, I'd like to begin with you because corruption of late has become synonymous with doing business on the continent, doing business here in South Africa even. And right now we've got the state of capture inquiry that is underway, that it's trying to root out just exactly how it all began. Going forward, though, in our attempts to reduce corruption here in the country, here on the continent, do you think that inquiries like the one that's currently underway in South Africa are the way to go?
Yes, I think we need inquiries like the Public Protector stated in her report. There must be a state of capture inquiry, and this is where we are now. It is still early days. We started off, the inquiry started off on Monday. I attended the first 2 days, and like I said, it's early days. It's going to be a long walk. I think for the next 24 months, we will be busy with the inquiry. And but to come back to the question, I think if we look at earlier inquiries in South Africa, the problem was that there was no political will to implement the recommendations. And hopefully, and I do believe that with this inquiry, we will have a different scenario with a political will and to implement the recommendations. Because,
I mean, 2 years is a really long time, and that's if it actually does fall within schedule, which leads one to ask, I mean, within 2 years, the individuals that we're looking at now that are the culprits of corruption could be elsewhere, which leads one to ask, I mean, with inquiries like this, will the people who are actually implicated for this corruption be held to account?
It is important that we remember that there were criminal charges laid against many of these implicated persons, and the inquiry and investigation into these charges must walk parallel and must carry on. The investigations in criminal charges cannot be stayed now. So hopefully, you know, the implicated person and the charged persons, or the people that charges were laid against, will be charged promptly, and that the NPA will go forward and prosecute these people.
And David, to bring you in right now, a comment from you about the role that inquiries such as the one that's underway right now in South Africa have in moving us closer to perhaps a corrupt free state, especially if you look at the cost of such inquiries. I mean, some might even argue, is it even worth it when we look at the bill that we have to foot for them?
Well, you know, it will be worth it. I mean, to be perfectly trite, it will be worth it if it produces tangible results. And I think that, you know, what we are looking for in this inquiry is not, as I think is popularly conceived, that person A is found guilty of offense X. You know, what we're looking for is an understanding of how state capture happened and what can be done to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And so, you know, we're looking for a more policy-oriented inquiry rather than a fact-finding inquiry. And I was pleased that they started yesterday with the Chief Procurement Officer reporting, because the procurement system is something that we need to get to the bottom of. And we need to identify what the vulnerabilities are in the procurement system that has enabled it to be one of the major sites of corruption. There's plenty evidence out there already for the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks to do their work and prosecute individual perpetrators. But what the advantage of an inquiry is that it can go, it can traverse far more widely than a court case, which is bound by what it is that the contending parties bring before it. In the case of an inquiry, the inquiry can shine light on corners that it's the evidence that it hears leads it into. It doesn't have to wait for witnesses to direct it to particular inquiry. So yes, and you know, if it finds out what the vulnerabilities are, the cost of 100 million rand or 200 million rand is small beer compared to what state capture has cost us. So yes, it's a lot of money, but if it's well spent, it's well worth it, because I mean, you know, some estimate that 100 billion rand has just been taken out of the country, never mind what has been hidden inside the country by this process of state capture.
I mean, David, Rudie's talking about the fact that with this inquiry in particular, now we're seeing greater political will, which is inspiring confidence in some corners that, you know, something will actually be done. But of course, we've had inquiries of this or similar scale here in South Africa before. One just has to look at the Marikana inquiry that took place there. But then one also looks at the outcome and the result of that, which up until today, we have an understanding or better understanding of what happened, but the individuals who were involved have still not been brought to book.
Yeah, you know, and that is a feature of an inquiry, that it is not binding. It makes recommendations. You know, I hear what Rudie says, and I think that he's right. I hope that he's right at any rate. You know, the truth of the matter is that inquiries are very often instruments that are used precisely not to get at the truth, to sweep things under the carpet, to kick into touch a difficult problem. And so the president who orders up the inquiry on the recommendations of one or other cabinet minister is often not trying to find answers. He is precisely trying not to find answers. In this instance, the former president set up the inquiry on the instructions of the public protector. If he had still been in office, I would have had no trust in this inquiry at all, because he would have had every reason for bearing its results, for not cooperating with it, for government not cooperating with it. However, in this instance, I think the president, the current president, to whom this inquiry will report, does have an interest in getting to the bottom of this, even if just to rid himself of the kinds of people who are preventing him from doing what he has stated that he wants to do, including, I might add, the former president.
Sure.
So he has a incentive to act on this.
Right. Well, let's get a different perspective now from the rest of the continent about corruption and rooting it out. And joining the conversation from Kigali, we have Apollinair Mupiganyi, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International in Rwanda. Sir, thanks so much for joining in. Perhaps you can come with some fresh lessons from Rwanda in how it's dealt with corruption. I understand that it's one of the least corrupt countries here on the continent. How did you get there?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to join the conversation. First of all, I would probably share the same view as the other speaker that our continent is still the one most prone to corruption in general, according to various surveys, including Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Of course, as you mentioned, Rwanda is among the best performers in this struggle, as Rwanda now from the Corruption Perception Index 2017 is ranked 48 at the global level. So what is behind, of course, I would, as an actor at the national level, we really see great political will and especially reforms, important reforms to ensure that all loopholes that can be favoring corruption practices are controlled. Just to give you an example, the recent reforms, for example, make corruption crime and prescribable crime in Rwanda. And it has been, this was a result of intense discussion and exchanges to see how really we can increase the cost of corruption for those who are, for the perpetrators of corruption. This is one of the little example to share with the others now.
No, fantastic. I mean, because many do say, Rudie, that the fact that, I mean, there's not any harsh penalties for doing wrong. I mean, for a simple thing like even stealing a car, it's an attractive crime for many criminals to commit. Sometimes, you know, it's just a matter of paying the police person a bribe or having the police person in it, unfortunately, sometimes, because we don't live in a society whereby we criminalize this act. And going forward, could this actually be a solution in achieving a corrupt-free state?
I think if we look at the harsher punishments for these acts and for corruption acts, I do believe that it will disencourage people to perform these corrupt actions. I just want to add or to agree with what the other speakers said, and maybe come with a proposal in that sense, is that I think right across the continent there is a lot of organizations like OUTA, like Corruption Watch, and I'm sure all over the continent, civil society organizations that are fighting these corrupt actions. And maybe it is time that these organizations across the continent take hands, work together, and come up with plans and come up with results as what they have in Rwanda.
Sure. So we're talking about collaboration between organizations. David, as we wrap up, I'd like to put this to you, because if we look at the commonalities across the continent, I mean, many African countries are faced with horrible, horrible poverty. There's inequality that's rife on the continent. Unemployment is just, it's sickeningly high. My question to you is, to what degree do these macro factors enable corruption to continue thriving? And should governments and perhaps business focus on factors like this, poverty and inequality, in helping root out the attractiveness to be corrupt?
No, I don't think it has anything to do with poverty. I mean, I think, one should be guided by the poverty that exists on our continent in the choice of sectors we choose to prioritize in fighting against corruption, because it's the poor people who rely on public health, public education, public transport, public security, who are really jeopardized and prejudiced by corruption. The perpetrators of corruption are very often the richest people in the society and not the poorest people in the society. And, you know, if you look at the record of the continent, you'll find a relatively rich country like South Africa, although an extremely unequal country, is ranked, I think it was 72nd in the Corruption Perceptions Index that Apollinair just referred to. Whereas Rwanda, Botswana, Mauritius, the Seychelles are performing much better. And it's really about the strength and weakness of institutions. And it's about the political will from the top. You know, one may or may not like all the things that Paul Kagame does, but there is no doubt about his views on corruption. And where the institutions are strong, where you have a reasonable prosecuting authority, policing authority, reserve bank, treasury, then you will be able to deal with corruption, whether you're in a poor country or a rich country. If those institutions are weak and vulnerable, you will not be able to deal with corruption, and they'll be made weaker and more vulnerable by corruption. But I don't think it's people who are hungry and people who are desperate who are the perpetrators of corruption. They are the victims of corruption, actually.
And thank you so much for your time. That is unfortunately all we have time for this evening. Thanks once again to my guests. And that's where we wrap it up for today's show. Remember to join us again on Monday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. And of course, remember, right after this break, we will have that interview with Paul Kagame, who is the president of one of Africa's least corrupt countries, that is Rwanda. He will be giving his very first live interview here on CNBC Africa. From myself, Fifi Peters, and the team, it's bye for now.